Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10, top 10 inaugural champions. With WWE bringing back the WWE Championship as a standalone championship, it gave me the idea for this top 10. For this list we're going to consider championships either from their very beginning or if a company splits off, like let's say the AWA when they split off from the NWA and they created a new heavyweight championship for themselves. We're going to consider that lineage when the lineage split. With that being said, we're rating them on the impact of the wrestler, the championship, its legacy, and everything that goes with that. Let's jump right in. Number 10, the inaugural NXT World Heavyweight Champion, Seth Rollins. Going from the game show version of NXT to the TV show version to what we know now as NXT, they needed to have someone that was going to carry the championship and be the flag bearer, be the guy basically leading the troops into war. What better guy than Seth Rollins? I mean, he was already a well-known name on the indies as Tyler Black. Since then, he's gone on to become one of the best wrestlers in the world, easily in the top 5 or 10. Left a lineage of great matches all over the world. If he were to retire today, he's an instant Hall of Famer. Just a great way to show what your championship is about. You have a great wrestler who's going to be one of your main eventers, a person that main evented WrestleMania multiple times, given that credibility, given that prestige to the championship. Awesome pick in my opinion, hence why it made our list. Now go from that on number 9, the inaugural IWGP Heavyweight Champion, Antonio Enoki. In the 50 years of New Japan Pro Wrestling, their main championship has gone by several different things. The longing-lasting iteration was the IWGP Championship. It began in '91 and just was retired last year. And who better to be your inaugural champion than the guy that started the federation, the guy that's synonymous with New Japan Pro Wrestling, an absolute legend in the wrestling business, someone that when you talk about the most influential Japanese wrestlers, he's in the top 3 with Giant Baba and Riki Dozan. And if you consider Riki Dozan, he's technically a Korean wrestler that just happened to wrestle in Japan. The impact and the reach of Enoki is far more than I could say on just this video here. I could literally make a video that runs 8 hours and I still wouldn't even scratch the surface of how influential he has been to the pro wrestling world and also the MMA world. And yes, the Enokiism, maybe some of the dark days of New Japan Pro Wrestling, as I've heard it being called. But even Babe Ruth didn't hit a home run every time he came up to bat. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. The Babe Ruth of Japanese wrestling, Antonio Enoki. Great way to start your championship. Going from that, at number 8, the inaugural WWF Heavyweight Champion, Buddy Rogers. A lot can be said about Buddy Rogers, much like Antonio Enoki, one of the all-time legends in pro wrestling, the original Nature Boy, and a guy that at the time had some controversy about being the NWA World Champion. WWF decides to break off from the NWA. This is the lineage that they're probably going to pick up for the new WWE Championship, and it starts with Buddy Rogers. And it can be argued that the Bruno Sammartino run doesn't catch as much steam if he doesn't beat Buddy Rogers for that. At the time, Buddy Rogers was pretty much the equivalent of Stone Cold or The Rock or any big wrestling superstar for the area. I know that they always had Bruno in mind to be the champion, but this was a great way to give the belt some prestige before handing it off to what is arguably their greatest champion of all time. Just a great way, again, to set a lineage, to put a name out there when you could put in the magazines that Buddy Rogers was the first champion. That meant something. That meant a lot. It still carries a lot of weight. Just a great way to start their championship, which obviously has gone on for the next 60 years now. Fantastic inaugural champion. I'll go from that on number 7. The inaugural NWA TNA X Division Champion, which is morphed to Impact X Division Championship now, AJ Styles. A lot could be said about the things that TNA has done wrong and the mistakes that they've made, and a lot of people like to harp on that. I personally like to look at all the contributions that they've made positively for pro wrestling. In an era where there was a big void between the WWE and everything else, TNA kind of filled that void. Not only did you have some of the greatest wrestlers in the world, AJ Styles, Kurt Angle, Ken Shamrock, you also had legends like Booker T, Kevin Nash, Jeff Jarrett, yes, he is a legend, all coming through and really developing this alternative brand for those of us that weren't quite on board with what WWE was doing. Not knocking WWE in any way, but there's a lot of disenfranchised WCW fans that TNA kind of picked up that ball for. It kind of is a spiritual successor to WCW, and a lot of people look at that in a negative way as well. They absolutely laid the groundwork perfectly here for what the X Division is. You have AJ Styles, one of the most phenomenal, pun intended, wrestlers over the last 25 years. I mean, there's a short list of guys that are as popular, as gifted in the ring, and as talented as AJ Styles. I mean, you basically have to look at guys like Kenny Omega, Bryan Danielson, Seth Rollins, who we mentioned already. Guys that you know can have fantastic matches no matter who they're in the ring with. In the case of AJ Styles, it could be anyone from X-Pac to Abyss, to Bobby Roode, to Eric Young, to his legendary matches with Christopher Daniels and Samoa Joe. Just an amazing way to start that lineage, show us what the championship's about with one of the great wrestlers that I've ever seen, and probably a lot of you have ever seen as well. I'll go from that on number 6. The inaugural AEW World Heavyweight Champion, Chris Jericho. There was no better way to start the lineage for the AEW Championship than to put it on a guy who, much like I just said with AJ Styles, is going to go down as an all-time great. He's in the short list of the greatest wrestlers of all time, maybe in the top 10 or top 15, and that's by any metric. If you want to go by championships, if you want to go by impact, longevity, money drawn, memorable feuds, anything you could think of that you would rate a wrestler by, Chris Jericho's right there in the top of the list. He's one of the great in-ring talents of all time. He's one of the great talkers of all time. He's had a lengthy career on the top. If you think about it, his run at the top of wrestling began in the early 2000s. So we're 20 years of Chris Jericho being on top or near the top. And he's done absolutely everything you can do in that time frame. You have a company here who started based off of a movement with the elite and was filled with a lot of guys that may have not been household names, but the one guy, and then eventually a couple more, obviously Moxley came in the first show, but the one guy that they had that everybody knew of before they even ran Double or Nothing was Chris Jericho. He's a household name in wrestling. He's a name that casual fans know who it is. People that never watch wrestling know of Chris Jericho. They know him from Dances with the Stars. They know him from other appearances. He's been in movies. He's done everything. So he's a fantastic way to bring fans over to the show and start a great lineage, which so far has had amazing world champions. Probably need to knock on wood, because as soon as I say that, they're probably going to have a championship run that's terrible. But in my opinion, it was a perfect way to start the show, to start the company, was to give it to Chris Jericho. Now going from that on number 5, the inaugural WWF Intercontinental Champion, Pat Patterson. Much like I said with the X Division title, you wanted to give a defined meaning to the Intercontinental Championship right away and give the fans what differs it from the World Championship. And right off the bat, it was a championship that was known as the Workers' Championship. I mean, if you look at that early list of wrestlers, it's a who's who of the best wrestlers in the company at the time. Guys like Patterson, Morocco, even Pedro Morales was a fantastic worker. Tito Santana, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Randy Savage. You look at all those early champions, even Ken Patera, these were all guys that could absolutely go in the ring and built that lineage, and it all started with Pat Patterson, who at the time, 1979, you could make an argument that Pat Patterson was the best in-ring wrestler in the world. It would be like if they created a championship today and gave it to Bryan Danielson. He's the absolute perfect person to set that tone for what that championship would be, set the expectations for what an Intercontinental Champion is, some of which are still carried to this day. And I love the fact that Gunther, aka Walter, has really brought some prestige back to that championship, because as a kid, that championship to me meant more than the World Championship a lot of times. My favorite guys were fighting for the Intercontinental Championship. Savage, Piper, Shawn Michaels, Rick Rude, all these guys were in the mix for that title. Not necessarily the world. Yeah, some of them were in the mix for the world, like Savage, obviously. But even then, I gravitated to more of the in-ring workers and more of the guys that were able to go at a different rate. And no knock on Hulk Hogan. Just saying that there was a difference. And Pat Patterson's the guy that set that bar. Now, coming from that, our number 4. Talking about setting a bar, the inaugural TNA World Champion, when they split from NWA, Kurt Angle. It's really going to start to sound like I'm repeating the same thing over and over again, but here you have Kurt Angle. Much like Chris Jericho, much like Antonio Inoki, much like Buddy Rogers, AJ Styles, all these other wrestlers, Kurt Angle is in that upper echelon. You had a company that already had somewhat of a buzz, had its own name, but it was kind of piggybacking off of the NWA. When they finally decided to make the split, there was no better wrestler to give it to than Kurt Angle. We're coming in an era where every wrestling fan in the world knew exactly who Kurt Angle was. He made the perfect champion to start that lineage. Again, like I've said with a lot of these wrestlers, that's why they're all on this list. They were all perfect to start the lineage of the belt. Gave TNA that same credibility they had by carrying the NWA Championship. Kurt Angle brought just as much credibility to the TNA Championship just by Kurt Angle being that champion. In my opinion, Kurt Angle's best work was in a TNA ring. I think he was absolutely fantastic there. I love Kurt Angle. This was awesome, hence why it made the list. I'll go from that, our number 2. On the other side of the fence, the inaugural TNA Knockouts Champion, Gail Kim. It could be argued since the inception of the Knockouts division that TNA has had the best women's wrestling in the world. Impact Wrestling now, year in and year out, and every other company's been playing catch up. Whether it be Gail Kim and Awesome Kong, whether it be the Beautiful People, whether it be Mickie James, ODB, or contemporaries like Deonna Purrazzo and Jordynne Grace, that Knockout Women's Championship carries such a prestige. To me, it's the most important women's championship in the world. No knock on what people like Bianca Belair, Rhea Ripley, Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch have done to bring the WWE championships up. No knock on the Britt Bakers and Jamie Hayters of the world who are bringing up the AEW championship. But when you look at that lineage and you look at the wrestlers that have held that championship, year after year, champion after champion, it's the elite of the elite in women's wrestling. And that all started with arguably the best wrestler of her generation, maybe on both sides of the fence, women and men, Gail Kim. Gail's an absolute trailblazer, a legend who has a ton of respect and still somehow feels like she doesn't get enough respect. That's how great Gail Kim was. Just having her being the standard bearer, the one that set the table, the one that started it off, instantly gave it credibility, instantly showed you that they got the best women's wrestling in the world. Turn to TNA if that's what you want to watch. Now going from that, our number 2, the NWA United States Champion. And yes, I know there have been several iterations of this belt. The one I'm specifically talking about is the one that started in the mid-70s with Harley Race. As I've mentioned a million times already in this video, you have Harley Race, one of the great legends in wrestling, up there with Buddy Rogers, Antonio Inoki. You could say he's even above them. He's in that cloud of wrestling where it's him, Ric Flair, Terry Funk, yes, Hulk Hogan, John Cena, Steve Austin, a guy that transcends wrestling. There was no question in the wrestling world in the mid-70s who the guy was. It was, if you were in the North, it was Bruno Sammartino. If you were anywhere else, it was handsome Harley Race. And when they decided to make this championship in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, what would eventually become Crockett, they put it on the absolute right guy. And just to show how important that lineage is, it carried over through WCW, it carried over when WWE purchased WCW. This championship is still being defended today, literally 3 companies later. And again, it could all be traced back to Harley Race. All the legends that have held this, the Ric Flairs, the Magnum TAs, the Dusty Rhodeses, the Tully Blanchard, Sting, Masahiro Chono, John Cena, all these guys that have held this championship, all goes right back to Harley Race, one of the greats of all time, one of the absolute legends in wrestling. Now, before we get to our number one, we have a thing here on my top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically things that were considered for the list, but not quite make it. First up, Charlotte Flair and the Raw Women's Championship. Coming out of the Divas Championship, the Divas era of wrestling, and the Women's Revolution, the Women's Wrestling Revolution of about a half decade ago, it was decided they were going to retire that, make it the Women's Championship, which is now the Raw Women's Championship, as they've got a Raw and SmackDown's version. They decided to put it on what essentially is the best women's wrestler of our generation, Charlotte Flair. And I know Charlotte has her detractors. She kind of got that Cena vibe where they rely on her a little bit too much like Roman Reigns at this time. But the reason they rely on her is she's reliable. She's a gold standard. She's the one that everybody else is measured by. If you want to take a championship that was associated with bra and panties and even at one point split in half and never really taken seriously, and that's not because of the amazing talents that held that Divas Championship, it's more of the booking, and you want to give it a serious flavor, there was no better wrestler to do that than Charlotte Flair. Now, last but not least, on the best of the rest, the NWA United States Tag Team Championship, the only tag team championship that was even considered for this list, Crusher Khrushchev and Ivan Koloff. For the generation that is younger than me, they won't quite understand just how big of a heat magnet just saying that someone was from Russia was. And to have two Russians be the inaugural U.S. Tag Team Championship and be able to flaunt that they're better than the Americans at a time where the United States and Russia were always one moment away from going into thermonuclear war. I mean, there's several movies that have been made about it. The threat of nuclear war was so prevalent at the time, and the threat that the Cold War was going to spill over into that was so rampant that kids of my age and probably a little bit older than me had to go through bomb drills when they were in school. Much like kids now have fire drills, or if you're in an area with tornadoes, tornado drills or hurricane drills. We had nuclear bomb drill. There was an air raid siren that you had to listen for, and you would get under your desk, which I don't know how that saved you from nuclear fallout, but it was part of the drill. In that climate, to have these two guys, and there have been a ton of Russian wrestlers. Khrushchev ended up being Demolition Smash, Repo Man Barry Darsow. He was a guy that became a Russian defector, which even made him 1,000 times worse. And you're talking about guys that were going into small towns in South Carolina, in the Virginias, in the West Virginia, into the Carolinas, all over, in areas where they still thought wrestling was real and they still believed in the gimmicks. There was no bigger heat magnet than the Russians, and that's what they called the team. And a perfect way to build an amazing heel and also give the fans something to wish for a good babyface United States team to come and take them championships from. Now, before we get to our number one, if you think I left the championship off the list, put one too high, put one down too low. Let me know what you think. Hit me down here in the comments. While you're there, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Share the video. If you see that button there that says join, that's how you become a member. I would definitely appreciate it if you did. With all that being said, my number one inaugural world champion or wrestling champion from when WCW split their lineage from the NWA, the other nature boy, Ric Flair. Every superlative I've said about every wrestler on this list can be put on to Ric Flair. You would be hard pressed to find a wrestling fan anywhere in the world that wouldn't put Ric Flair in their top 5 wrestlers of all time, and most of us consider him to be the number one guy. I personally have a tie with him and Terry Funk as the number one guys, and a lot of that is my personal love and respect for Terry Funk. I can't argue that Ric Flair isn't one of the most influential wrestlers of all time, one of the greatest in-ring talents, one of the best talkers of all time. One of the guys, much like I said with Jericho, his name is synonymous with pro wrestling. There are people that have never watched one wrestling match in their life. If you say the word Ric Flair to them, they'll go, woo! Because everybody knows the woo. Everybody knows Ric Flair. Everybody knows the jet flying, limousine riding, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing, son of a gun. I mean, he's a legend. Rappers have based their whole careers off of them. If you go on Spotify, I think there's something like over 100 songs about Ric Flair. I mean, some of the more famous ones, the Migos did the Ric Flair drip. Killer Mike has a song about Ric Flair. Rappers have said Ric Flair's name more than they've said Versace, and that's a lot. I can guarantee you, if Ric Flair is not your favorite wrestler, he's probably your favorite wrestler's favorite wrestler. Everybody from Steve Austin to Shawn Michaels to the entire generation that came after them, everybody looked up to Ric Flair, and if they didn't, they looked up to somebody that looked up to Ric Flair. To me, he's the epitome of what a wrestling world champion should be. When I think of a world champion, I see Ric Flair in my head. When I think of a pro wrestler, I see Ric Flair in my head. When I think of the greatest of all time, I see Ric Flair in my head. Hence why he's my number one. With all that being said, again, if you think I put someone too high, too low, left them off the list altogether, let me know in those comments. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, let me know you made it to the end by giving me your favorite inaugural champion. It doesn't have to be somebody on this list. It could be somebody totally different. Let me know down here what you think. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and it's been another Heel Heat Top 10.